Well, hello and good afternoon to everyone. My name is Victoria Williams, and I'm an Assistant Director of Programs here at the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. Thanks to you all, and especially to the Chicago Council members for joining us today for our conversation via Zoom with Secretary Henry Paulson and Ambassador Robert Zoellick. As a reminder, the Chicago Council is an independent and nonpartisan platform, so the views expressed by those that we host are their own and do not represent institutional positions or views of the Council. Thank you to those that have already pre-submitted their questions to our speakers. If you would still like to ask a question or vote for one that someone else has already asked, you can open up your browser to ccga.live and do so there. But today's program is also on the record. A recording of the conversation will be made available on our website and social channels shortly. Now, it is my absolute pleasure to welcome Ambassador Robert Zoellick, who is the former president of the World Bank and U.S. Trade Representative. He currently serves as Senior Fellow at the Belfer Center at Harvard University's Kennedy School. He will be in conversation today with Secretary Henry Paulson, who is the founder and chairman of the Paulson Institute and the former Secretary of Treasury under President George W. Bush. Thank you both for joining us today. And with that, I'll actually hand it over to you, Secretary Paulson.
Well, Victoria, thank you very much, and welcome to everyone. I'm really looking forward to our conversation today with my good friend, Bob Zoellick. Bob is that American who best understands trade policy and economic policy and foreign policy, and that is really saying something. And he not only understands policy, he has a track record of getting important things done, getting them done at the Department of Treasury, getting them done at the State Department, getting them done as a U.S. Trade Representative and as President of the World Bank. And I can't think of a time when I've enjoyed reading a book more than his masterpiece, America in Foreign Policy, or excuse me, America in the World. This book, I believe, is a groundbreaking book in that it establishes a new framework for helping people understand the history of American foreign policy. And it does so through some really multiple chapters, which are short, easy to read, vignettes involving important American historical figures ranging from Benjamin Franklin, to Alexander Hamilton, to Abraham Lincoln, to Teddy Roosevelt, to John F. Kennedy, to George H.W. Bush, and many others. So, Bob, it's no easy feat to write a book, and you've written one. It's right here behind me, my library. I'll grab it here. It's America in the World. So let's start right here with America in the World. Bob, what inspired you to write this book?
Well, first, Hank, let me thank you for being so gracious. I don't know if you do funeral orations, but that if we could tape that, that might be useful. But also, I want to thank the Chicago Council. As someone who grew up in the Midwest, I really appreciate the efforts it makes to connect Midwesterners with the international environment. And I look forward in particular, I think maybe this September, you're going to produce that annual survey that you do about American attitudes, which I've often been able to reference and is really a gold mine. So I want to thank both of you. As for the book, Hank, I've had the idea for a number of years. A number of people on this call may very well remember Henry Kissinger wrote a book titled Diplomacy about 25 years ago. And in that book, he used history to talk about diplomacy and foreign policy. But when I read the book, it seemed that he tended to reflect a European perspective. So for a long time, I've been trying to, how could I do this from an American experience and some of the American ideas? And so the approach I took, as you mentioned, was to use stories. A lot of people enjoy biographies. And so I focus on individuals, particular problems, and the practical work of diplomacy, trying to bring in some of the experience that you and I have had. I suppose one of the other ideas in the back of my mind was that the field of diplomatic history, as it was once known, has somewhat faded over the years. And for understandable reasons. Historians have wanted to bring in other actors, perspectives, but it's led to a certain fragmentation. And as Fred Logoval, who's a historian at Harvard, wrote a piece not too long ago, said, why have we stopped teaching political history? So I wanted to try to modestly revive the craft. And in doing so, from my experience with work colleagues, often younger ones, I had a sense that insofar as the history was taught, it tended to focus on events after World War II or during the Cold War. And there's a rich set of stories about the first 150 years of American history. So I wanted to bring some of those figures back to life. And I suppose in the current environment, there's one other thought, which is, after Secretary Mattis stepped down from the Defense Department, I noted he was observing that the United States doesn't have the same full domain dominance in military terms, he said, it used to have. And I was reflecting, during much of my diplomatic career, but even frankly, during earlier periods, America wasn't always the most powerful player on the block, but it still had to conduct diplomacy. So maybe there's some things to learn when the United States was didn't have the full scope of power. In some cases, in the early period, was quite weak, but still operated successfully.
So, Bob, a major theme of your book is pragmatism, right? So how do you see it? Why is it so important to diplomacy today? And what is American pragmatism?
Well, probably like many people in the Chicago Council community, I enjoyed many books about foreign policy. They often bring an intellectual framework, and those are interesting to work around and think about and debate. But as I reflected on my own experience, or the way I looked at the historical reading I have, much of diplomacy, foreign policy, economic policy, as you've been involved in, is trying to solve real problems in very practical ways. And then I make a connection. Some people may be aware that pragmatism actually began as a philosophical concept that was truly American. And it the idea was to reject intellectual abstractions, conventions, dogmas, and instead look to practical consequences and experience. So it was based on trying to have a sense of means and ends and focus on results, what works. And so as I thought about diplomacy, that's the connection that I saw with much of the American experience, in that it often begins with a sense of realities on the ground. Whether it's an issue of power of military or economics or technology, or as you know, Hank, putting together the votes, either domestically or internationally. But then also an importance about understanding the processes and institutions in which you're operating. How do they really work? So whether it's the G20 for you, or the IMF, or the World Bank, or the Federal Reserve, central banks, how do these really get things done? Because otherwise, if you don't know those levers, you're not going to be able to be very effective. It's also important to know the positions of others. How do they look at the problem? What interests do they see? Where can you work with them? Where you're going to have to negotiate with them? An important role for timing. For business people on the call, they're well aware of chance and contingency, as we're dealing with right now in the context of a pandemic. So I wanted to try to explain from my reading of history and through it some of my experience about the practical sense of what works. Perhaps there's another theme to this, which is my reading of policy is that often statespeople are trying to achieve imperfect results in a far from perfect world, and one has to build on them. But there's a certain optimism to that view of history as well, which is that history can offer insights on do better as opposed to timeless obstacles that are impervious to change. So this is, I suspect, an experience that would parallel yours in the public or the private sector as well. And I wanted to share that story with readers through these individual accounts.
Yeah, and what really resonates with me, it's all about getting things done. And your book takes it a step further, because rather than, again, talking in terms of abstractions and theories, you bring it right down to stories of, of problem solvers, political figures, important figures that solve problems. And you've got these interesting stories. And so I'd like to talk about a couple of them so let's start with Alexander Hamilton. We both worked at the Treasury Department. Alexander Hamilton, first Treasury Secretary. He's known for his economic chops, his economic policy. Tell us about Alexander Hamilton, the diplomat. Tell us about it.
Well, as you noted, one of the reasons I wanted to bring Hamilton early is, many people would see him as the founder of American economic policy, but he's also the founder of economic statesmanship for the United States. And as I outlined in his account, he had this rare ability to understand how the individual problems related to systems of power, whether they be economic or legal or even military. And I note, for example, in 1781, so he's just on leave from the Continental Army, and he's analyzing the position of the United States and Great Britain. And he focuses on this critical issue of the power of credit. And in a sense, he understands that the Revolutionary War is a war of attrition. And it's a challenge of who will be able to survive in this environment. So, he's the one that builds America's credit system, which you and others used at moments of peril. And I think it's not a bad reminder that these are things that we shouldn't take for granted. He also, however, had a strategic view. He saw the United States as how it fit in a wider Atlantic world. So this was not an isolationist by any means. He also had a sense of land as well as maritime power. So he was focused on what at that time you would have called the second seacoast, the Mississippi River Valley, which becomes very important with the Louisiana Purchase and Jefferson. He also has a sense of balance of power relationships. He's quite artful in that. Talleyrand, who's in the United States in this period, the later French foreign minister for Napoleon and after Napoleon, sort of says Hamilton has the ability to divine Europe. And what he's saying is he understands these political forces. Then when Hamilton takes office, he's actually more practical than Jefferson, who's the first Secretary of State. Hamilton tries to develop what we would call today a strategic dialogue with Britain. And it's quite interesting to see his idea. Even though Britain had been the recent foe, he understands that America would operate best within a British environment, a trading environment. But he says for that to work, Britain has to treat America with respect. There's some key issues such as the posts that are still in the western part of the United States. In a way, he's envisioning the special relationship that takes about 100 years to develop. And it's an interesting coincidence because the British leader, Lord Shelburne, who's in charge of the peace negotiations at the end of the Revolutionary War, has a similar view. But both of them don't have the political power at home to carry it forward. And I think that's one of the other themes that I try to draw out is the importance of the political basis of this. So Hamilton becomes, with George Washington, the driver of what is known as American neutrality policy, which is a key issue for us kind of through World War I. And in a very practical sense, when people think about the conflicts with Britain or the undeclared war with France, many of them are unaware that it's the customs revenues that are supplying over 90% of America's revenues at that time. So if you're going to pay the interest on the debt, you need to be able to have the trading system. And then Hamilton works with Washington to incorporate these ideas in what are known as Washington's farewell address, which really is a plea for union. And there's a little bit of a parallel today because part of the challenge at that period was foreign intervention, particularly French with the French Revolution instead of American politics. And Washington or Hamilton are looking for the long game. They're trying to say, look, we have to be able to maintain our credit. We have to be able to sort of get the economy going. We believe we can grow into a power, but we have to get through this early phase. And if you like, wonderful ironies, Jefferson, who's in the next chapter, would have never been able to buy the Louisiana Purchase if you didn't have a credit system which allowed us to take those well-regarded U.S. bonds that Hamilton had developed. The last thing about Hamilton I want to add is that throughout the book, I also try to add some insights on the practice of diplomacy, the methods of how it's done for people. And Hamilton is one of those rare individuals that understands that the most effective leaders don't just respond to events, they have to shape them. And in fact, he draws this from his reading of a French finance minister, Colbert. He also has a sense to perceive the whole system and how events fit within it. And both he and Ben Franklin, who's in the introduction, have another insight that I'm sure you knew as an investment banker and as an official, which is that often very minor events can affect the attitudes of important people and the circumstances that flow. And so that sort of human interaction and emotions are important, as well as the rationality of a foreign policy.
Yeah, quite a man. And he started off, as you'll remember, understanding markets just as a kid trading in the West Indies. So which of your historical figures that you use to tell your story do you think is most underrated by historians?
Well, I really enjoyed the chapter on Lincoln and Seward, in part because, well, Lincoln in particular is a great figure from history. Most people who think about the US Civil War think about generals and battles or slavery or social effects. Very few think about the foreign policy. And yet, if you reflect on it, if Britain or France had intervened and supported the Confederacy, history could have taken a very different course. And so they actually take office in an environment where the outgoing administration under President Buchanan had basically signaled to the world secession is going to happen. So they have to walk a very fine line. On the one hand, they have to raise the threat level and cost to Britain and France. On the other hand, they have to act with restraint. And by the way, I think that combination of threat and restraint is one that you see throughout foreign policy. They're engaging in a certain brinksmanship. And I tell the story of how they basically avoid one crisis in 1861. There's another opportunity in 1862 with what today would be called humanitarian intervention. So in Europe, it looked like the United States was this bloodletting, could they have a ceasefire? Could they have an armistice? And how they avoid that. And then also the interesting use of the Emancipation Proclamation and how it's first received in Britain, not so positively, because from the British perspective, remember, they've had what they call the Indian Mutiny in 1857. So encouraging servile peoples to rise up doesn't look so good to them. But Lincoln and Seward are shrewd at how they reach out to working class and the middle class in Britain, including through letters and other efforts to bring them on side. Then Teddy Roosevelt is, of course, always a wonderful figure, but most people associate Teddy Roosevelt with going up on San Juan Hill or the Great White Fleet and the notion of use of American power. The story that I tell is the story of how he mediated the Russo-Japanese War and the first Moroccan crisis, and he was quite a good mediator. So, as you know, if you're in the Roosevelt Room in the West Wing today, you'll see a big portrait of Roosevelt on a horse going up San Juan Hill, although he didn't have the horse on the hill. But right below it is Peace Prize, for which he won it for this sort of mediation effort. And it's quite an amazing story of how he puts the parties together. Some people might have known about the Russo-Japanese War. The first Moroccan crisis has certainly faded into history. But that's a wonderful case because in some ways, if you think about it, here's this crisis on the periphery of Europe involving Germany, France, Britain, sort of Russia on the side. And it's exactly a crisis on the periphery of Europe in 1914 that leads to World War I. Then I also talk about Charles Evans Hughes, who's another wonderful figure that's sort of lost to time. He was a governor of New York. He was an associate justice of the Supreme Court. He almost wins the 1916 presidential election against Woodrow Wilson, but he loses California by, I think, about 3,800 votes. And he comes in after Wilson's debacle at the end of World War I, the League of Nations, and the Senate basically expects it's going to be running everything. And he takes what is a movement for naval arms control, budget cuts, unresolved business in East Asia, and he launches what's called the Washington Conference, which deals with naval arms control as well as regional security. And I talk a little bit about how one can see arms control as an ongoing process, which, by the way, I would draw some analogies if you're thinking about North Korea today or Iran, how you have to consider the regional issues along with the arms control issues. And then one other one I'll just mention is Vannevar Bush. This wouldn't appear in most books on foreign policy, but Vannevar Bush is the godfather of an American diplomacy that expects and leverages scientific and technological change. So Vannevar Bush is the man who launches American science policy after World War II, and in doing so, creates a special relationship among universities, private business, and basic scientific research, which many people would argue was the core of our success against the Soviet Union, will probably be a challenge in the world with China today of this. And I draw one other aspect of this. The reason I included him was I believe science and technology and policy will become increasingly important. This is a question of pandemics, climate change, or others. So Bush is another wonderful figure that people will enjoy reading about.
Well, you left out my favorite, which was Will Clayton, maybe because I'm a businessman and I see a guy who was a cotton broker, and I just love the fact that business people can go in and out of government. But, I focused on the Marshall Plan. I'd never heard of Will Clayton, and I think he was key to that, and to the Bretton Woods institutions also. But I don't want to go off on a tangent.
Well, let me just take a minute because it gives people a little feel for the book. So I have a chapter on the decisions of 47 to 49 that sort of led to the creation of the Alliance and Economic Order. But that ground has been well covered recently by Ben Steele on the Marshall Plan and others. So my approach, as you suggested, was to try to draw some of the figures that were less known. And Will Clayton is definitely one of those figures as a business executive, but also I compare him a little bit with the influence of Kennan, which historians like because Kennan writes beautifully, he's very philosophical. But I actually note, for example, how Clayton did his business and his memos and the influence of him. But there's one other figure from the Midwest that I wanted to draw in here. I also draw in Senator Vandenberg, because part of my other theme is to be successful, American foreign policy needs to have support in the Congress, and it needs to have public support, just as the Chicago Council does with its surveys. And I wanted to draw in how Vandenberg worked, because I think that if you think about people like McCain or Lugar or Nunn or frankly Howard Baker, or perhaps ones we'll need to find today, that's going to be an important part of America's foreign policy future.
So, Bob, there's so many big issues in the world I want to talk about, and we're on the clock here. I'd like to ask you one last issue about your book before moving on. Is, you say foreign policy is about advancing American ideas, right? Ideas, ideals, whatever. So what do you think are the most important ideas that we need to advance? We either have advanced or need to advance.
So I try to pull these stories together with 5 traditions. And the 5th tradition is America's purpose in the world. And just to give people, again, a little bit of a colorful feel, I remind them that if you look on the Great Seal of the United States, you'll find this phrase, Novus Ordo Seclorum, New Order of the Ages. And for those of you that wonder what this looks like, if you still have a wallet, take out your wallet and look at the back, and you'll see on the back of a dollar bill, the seal of the unfinished pyramid with Eye of Providence above it, Novus Ordo Seclorum below it. And my point is, from the founding ages, these individuals were thinking about something bigger. They had the idea about what America was trying to create was going to be something more important worldwide, not just within the former 13 colonies. But my point is that those ideas change over time. So in the early 1800s, it's simply preserving a republic in the world of empires. In the middle of the century, it's preserving the Union and dealing with the sin of slavery that had sort of poisoned the system from the start. So part of my point is the basics are liberty, open society, adaptability, and in the spirit of pragmatism, the opportunities change as the United States power grows and it has different sort of relationships. the 47-49 story is how we move away from 150 years of avoiding alliances. So I remember on the Chicago Tribune, it used to say on the header about the sort of Washington's guidance about no permanent alliances and no entangling alliances. Well, this changes in right after World War II. So for 70 years, we have an alliance system. So I would say one of the critical ideas now is how will we use that? How will we adapt that to circumstances? And then I come back to this point about sort of optimism about history offering insights on how you can do better. So those are some of the ideas, and that will be for this generation to figure out America's role.
Bob, I tell you, it's a terrific book, and I enjoyed reading it. I know many others will. So let's now pick your brain on some of the biggest issues of the day. Now, you and I both see US-China relations as one of the biggest, most important challenges of this century. What insights, let's start with history. What insights can you give us on this from a historical perspective to set the stage here?
Well, this is a wonderful opportunity because I think, while China, as you say, is in the spotlight today, it's helpful for Americans to understand kind of the themes of our prior relationships with China. And I would draw out three. First, from 1784 on, when Robert Morris sends a ship to deliver ginseng from Appalachia to China, there's this notion of China as the great market, the great commercial opportunity. Often a star just over the horizon, not quite achieving what we would like, but as you would know, Hank, until the Trump administration, China was the fastest growing market for US export for 15 years. The second is China as a power or potential power. And here, if you think about at the time of the Boxer Rebellion, the Europeans and Japanese were threatening to carve up China, just as they had just carved up Africa. People often don't draw that connection. And the United States stands for the territorial integrity of China and the open door. In the 1920s, when you have a new Chinese republic, part of this naval arms control and regional agreement was to try to create a stronger basis for China to get hold of its countryside. In World War II, FDR looks upon China as one of the potential four horsemen afterwards. Nixon and Kissinger bring China back into the sort of the realpolitik game. And so the second theme is, where does China fit in the power structure? But the third one is equally important, which is from the very start, Americans have had a missionary impulse towards China. And this was indeed the Christian church and the Christian missionaries were very important in defining our early attitudes towards China. A lot of the foreign service officers were the children of missionaries. Pearl Buck with the Good Earth is a child of missionaries. And so in a way, for some 150 years, we've been trying to convert China, whether to Christianity, whether to small r republicanism, whether to small c capitalism. And there's an effect of this, which is that when the Chinese disappoint us, when they decide to become Chinese as opposed to junior Americans, Americans react with quite hostility because we're being rejected. There's a fear, there's an anger that develops, as you saw in the Boxer Rebellion, you saw in 1949, we saw in 1989, and we're seeing it today as well. And so that's an interesting backdrop with one other addition. Part of what I also do in this book is I try to draw in some of the international environment. And as you know, whether one agrees with it or not, it's very important to understand how the Chinese view their history and their sense of the century of humiliation. And maybe they overplay it, maybe they look at the history through a narrow lens. But part of, I think, my larger message is we need to know our history, but we also need to know how others view their history.
So let's move to what we're dealing with today. So this is a very different China than we were dealing with even 5 years ago. Very different world, different United States. What should the objectives be of our policy with China? We see all sorts of actions being taken, being contemplated, being debated. This is a relationship that is in a downward spiral, a very dangerous downward spiral right now, and it's, for a long time, at least I've had the sense that each side sort of defined where the bottom should be, and no one knows where the bottom of the U.S.-China relations is today. So what should our objectives be?
Well, I start with
what are a realistic set of objectives?
Your concern, which both our former colleague Evan Feigenbaum has called free fall, and I think that's not a bad description. And as you said, we're not sure where the bottom is, and that's a dangerous situation. But so for practical objectives, I'd start out, of course, with success at home. In other words, the power that we will have with China and the rest of the world depends on whether we create a model of attraction. By the way, Secretary of State Seward saw this at the end of the Civil War. Then in security terms, I think Alfred Thayer Mahan, the Navy captain and the later admiral, had the idea about our interest in security across the Pacific perimeter, and not necessarily getting into land conflicts in Asia, but how we can represent our interests with allies, with the right military capacity, with a view of freedom of the seas. And then third, I still believe that, and this is where I think there's a mistake in the recent debate, people have assumed that cooperation with China failed. And I wrote an article in the National Interest earlier this year where I went through a litany of things you and I and others have done. And that doesn't mean everything is great with China, but whether it's proliferation, whether it's the economic topics, whether environmental topics, there's a lot that served America's interest. And so if I look at the world today and I ask myself, how are we going to be able to deal with pandemics and biological security? How are we going to deal with inclusive economic growth? How are we going to deal with environmental and climate issues? How are we going to deal with proliferation of weapons of mass destruction and problem countries? There can be, I believe, practical work that can be done with China, but it needs to be done in cooperation with our allies and partners. And as you know, find those forces within China that also want to take some of these changes. Now, you would probably agree, under President Xi, I think there's been a change on these topics. I think in his view of history, the shadow of the fall of the Soviet Union casts a very dark mark over China. And you can see with his efforts with the Communist Party, he's kind of trying to avoid that sort of future for China. So we have to deal with a different China. And in that, in addition to the areas of cooperation and security, I think we should always continue to stand for freedom, but stand for freedom as an aspiration. So in my chapter on Reagan, I talk about how he did this with the Soviet Union. I'm afraid today we tend to be using freedom as a club to beat people and to insult people. And I'll give you practical examples of how it would be different. Hong Kong. You know, I'm not sure that just sanctioning people left and right to stop dialogue is going to be useful. If you want to send a message about the difference in the societies, why don't we do what Britain and to a degree Australia and others have done, where we say, let's let some of the people from Hong Kong come to America. It'd be good for us. It'd be a good signal to the world. That would emphasize freedom. I'm very worried about cutting off students from China. I think this is going to be a long-term problem for us. And frankly, you know, for people who are Chinese Americans, there's a rising, you know, racist element to this that is very, very disturbing. So I think part of the problem today with our policy, I think, is people throw verbal bombs. But if you ask, well, what are you wanting to accomplish? Back to my pragmatism, what are the results? Okay, what within deterrence, you know, are we trying to overthrow the Chinese regime? Do we really think we can contain China? So I'm not saying that all is well with Xi and with China, far to the contrary. You and I have seen some of the darker sides of the system, but I also think you can get some business done that will be in our mutual interests.
Bob, I couldn't agree with you more. And I also, the other thing I see when talking to people who will point to abuses they see or things that they see in China that are very disturbing. And then when you look at what they're proposing to do about it, in many cases, what they're proposing to do would hurt us more than it would hurt China. Or they would, you know, if you're looking to decouple, of course, we're going to have to decouple in many ways. But if we go too far and the rest of the world's not going to decouple, we're going to isolate ourselves. So the reason I asked you about this, not only are you an expert on China, but your whole focus on pragmatism is what are we trying to accomplish? What can we accomplish? And starting at home is key. So I'm going to move because we have some good questions from the audience. I'd like to get to some of those. But the first one is sort of a fun one. You've had multiple jobs in government. What was your favorite job in government? What did you like best? And I know you enjoyed it. You know, the one thing I love about you, Bob, is every job you did with enthusiasm. You loved it. You was 100%. So I know this is going to be a hard one for you because you loved them all. But what did you like best?
Well, there were different aspects. So I'll pick a couple. So I worked with Secretary James Baker at the Treasury Department in the late 80s, but then particularly at the end of the Cold War from 89 to 92. So that was an extraordinarily eventful time. I had a great and powerful boss, and we got a lot of things done. So that was enjoyable. When I was U.S. Trade Representative in 2001, I had the good fortune of having President Bush 43 be interested in trade, but it couldn't be his top priority given everything else that was going on. So I had a fair amount of freedom to drive both the strategy as well as the particulars of the agenda. And if you think about most of the free trade agreements America has today, frankly, they were launched during this time period, and kind of the energy is sort of ebbed out of the system. And then with the World Bank, as you know, because you were part of this, it's a great institution with great potential. I came in kind of a point of a leadership crisis, so I had to do a turnaround. And there was a challenge coming in as a Republican to a multilateral institution, but I think I was able to bring together people to help in the financial crisis and food crisis, and also be quite innovative on things like open data and women and gender issues. So in their own way, they're fun. It's fun to run your own show, but it's also fun to be at the crux of a historical moment like German unification.
You betcha. So here's another question. So this questioner, says, we're going to have an election, coming up, and assuming that there's a President Biden, what do you think the new President Biden will need to do to restore our prestige in the world, to make us impactful? What should be the priorities in foreign policy of a new administration?
So on this one, I'm going to offer you a little different perspective than people might be reading or hearing about, because obviously if Biden's elected, his team is going to have a lot that they're going to want to change. But going back to this pragmatic spirit, as I think about it, think about the agenda President Biden faces at home. He'll have a pandemic, he'll have a frayed healthcare system, he'll have the need for inclusive economic growth, he'll have the racism issues, he'll have immigration issues, he'll have environment and climate issues. That is a huge agenda, yeah? And if you think about whether it's President Carter or Clinton or Obama, even with Democratic Congresses, they have the challenge of what priorities do they set? How do they build success as opposed to just overloading the system, and in their cases often losing political support after 2 years. Recall that my boss Baker, when he was chief of staff for Reagan, said you have three priorities: economic recovery, economic recovery, and building economic recovery gave the basis for going to his larger agenda. So I think while Joe Biden enjoys foreign policy, would like to engage on these issues, part of his strength as a legislator is he may have the better ability to work with Congress than anybody since LBJ. So his time's going to be at a premium. So what I suggest, and I'm actually writing this for a piece that may come out next month online with Foreign Affairs, to say, leverage off your domestic agenda. If you do something on immigration or the Dreamers, connect it with Mexico and the North American policy, and dealing with Central America. If you're dealing with the pandemic issues, perhaps combine it with an international initiative like Bush 43 did with HIV/AIDS for Africa and developing countries. And similarly, if you're dealing with a climate change agenda, don't just rejoin the Paris Accord, but try to see how you could rebuild stronger support, say, in developing countries with soil carbon for agriculture in Africa, or forestation or avoided deforestation. So what I try to do is I go through each of those and say, look, how could you leverage these, your domestic agenda internationally, be efficient with that? But then there's one other part, which is if you take those issues plus, say, regional security from hegemons and arms control issues, that's not a bad agenda to be focusing on with your European and Asian allies. That's in some ways a more modernized agenda. And on top of that, then you could add the question of the future of freedom and how are we together going to deal with China? So it's this idea of how do you build on the practical work you need to do at home, work with your allies, and then build an agenda off it, as opposed to having a list of 40 things you want to do.
Bob, I tell you, you are so right. If you don't prioritize, you get nothing done. And as you said earlier, strength begins at home. If you don't have an economy and a political system that others want to emulate, then you're not going to have a successful foreign policy. And if we lose our fiscal strength, our economic strength, we're not going to get things done. We're not going to be a great power. So that's.
But the other side of it, and this is kind of the optimistic side, as you know, Hank, America has this incredible ability to reinvent itself. And there's what looks like a mess to the outside world is partly a mess, but it's also how we come to terms with it. And as you know, whether in China or Russia, or as you see in Belarus, they have messes too. It's just not on the surface.
Yeah, we shine, as I said, after the financial crisis. When we have a mess, we shine a bright light on it for the whole world, and then we move to clean it up. And we've just got a bigger mess to clean up, in 2021. That's some other times. I've shoveled, I've cleaned out a few barns in my life.
It does help to have competent people in charge, I have to say.
Yeah, so, but Bob, I'm going to ask you, I got another question from the audience, which I like. I got a lot of questions, but one is your assessment of the recent UAE-Israeli deal. And what I like about you is we've all read assessments, and I don't know what you're going to say, but I guarantee you I'm going to hear something different or innovative from you. So give us your assessment. UAE, Israel, what do you have to say about it?
Well, when I read about the deal, actually, it reminded me of a point we touched on early in this discussion about Charles Evans Hughes. And that point was, it's important to see arms control in the context of regional security and stability. So you can argue for or against the Obama nuclear deal with Iran, but I think one of its weaknesses was it looked at arms control without recognizing some of the other dangers of Iran in terms of its advancing power in the region and its missiles and other topics. So I think the UAE-Israel deal needs to be seen in the context of whether Israel, UAE, others in the region can deal in a more cooperative fashion with the dangers that they see from Iran. So, and again, on the notion of foreign policy, the question here will be, can the US government bring in other players, Oman, Kuwait, Bahrain, Morocco, others, start to build that notion about sort of a different strategic approach to Iran. And then longer term, it's also a question of whether this will allow Israel to reshape its approach with the Palestinians. So when I was at the World Bank, I worked with Salam Fayyad, who was one of the reformers in the Palestinians, and I worked with the Israelis because I believe that the Palestinians, to be successful, had to move beyond victimhood, and they had to sort of start to create an economic opportunity of their own. But the Palestinian leadership is aged, it's sort of been unwilling to face these issues. This could create the opportunity for people to come to terms with a new reality. So, as is often the case, if you look at the deal by itself, I mean, UAE has an interest because, frankly, they've been under some criticism. This will probably get some more US support, maybe some US military sales, maybe secure them with either a Biden or future Trump administration in their relationship. So there's some of those near-term aspects. But I would urge people to try to think of how we can then build on this with a regional strategy.
Bob, thank you very much. You know, we've run out of time. We could have gone on a lot longer, but I thank you. I thank everyone for joining us on the call today. And I want to remind you, this book, America in the World, that you can purchase this. If you look at the chat function, you'll see a link, and you can purchase this directly from the bookseller, Cellar, right here in Chicago. So again, thank you, Bob. Thank you, everyone, and have a good afternoon.
Well, thank you, Hank, and thanks to the Chicago Council for hosting us. Appreciate it.